All right, so I'm very happy to be here today. So I'm a writer, producer, and activist of Kenyan descent. I grew up here in New York City, so I'm a very proud Pan-African New Yorker. So there's a series of questions we were asked, and I'm going to go along those questions in terms of my presentation. And then also I'll do a little reading of some work that I have coming out soon. So in terms of self-representation, post 9/11, just like the brother over here, I really kind of was born out of that time in a way. Even though, interestingly enough, I was actually born during a military coup in Kenya. So in a certain way, I kind of feel like conflict is a part of my life. And incidentally, also, there's an entire generation of people in their 30s and younger in this world, outside of America and in America, who have known a lot of conflict. Like their entire lives have been built out of various geopolitical situations. So I think conflict, whether or not you talk about September 11th or other people who experienced wars in the 90s or the 80s, a lot of people are born out of the same stuff that came to America, you know, and knocked on its door just about 10 years ago. So, as far as 9/11, I was actually a freshman in college at the time that happened, and had a very strong impression on me. It made me think a lot, just like the first Gulf War did. I was quite young when that happened, but I remember being very aware of it and very concerned about it. And by the time September 11th happened, it had another level of kind of impact and influence. And frankly, as an immigrant, I dealt with a lot of the problems that came out of September 11th, particularly out of INS. I was someone who, at the time, even though I'd been here for a long time, I was on a diplomat visa because my mother worked for the UN, right? But then at some point, I was doing all the paperwork to apply for permanent residency. And I found myself completely in the same quagmire as almost everybody who was an immigrant at that time trying to go to INS. And I don't know if not many people know about this, and I'm happy to actually mention it, that you had to actually line up at about 3 in the morning to get into the building at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. And they'd only take the first like 20 or 50 people in the line. So you'd be there in the winter, standing outside, waiting to get into this building, and then they treat you badly usually. And it was actually one of those experiences when I was there with everybody. I was there with the whole world, and we're all being treated like crap after that period. And it really, in a way, inspired a lot of my thinking about why it was important to talk about uncomfortable conversations and things like that. So even around that time as well, I also had a kind of consciousness raising of my own in college, where I realized how much of a problem institutionalized racism was. I'm actually working on a book about the problem of formal education in terms of perpetuating inequality as opposed to actually supporting or helping in any way. So by the time I was in college, that's really what made me realize that, because I went to very good schools in this country, predominantly white schools for that reason. And I remember kept on seeing all the black kids being tracked sometimes into remedial classes or in different situations. And I'd even talk to other kids and be like, why are you in that class? I know you can do at least a regular level class. And they were so often discouraged or somehow made to feel that they couldn't actually accomplish certain things. And I even came into a high school where I had straight A's and they put me in remedial math, and only because I argued with the dean did I actually get myself into regular level math. So all of these things made me really think a lot about race, a lot about gender, a lot about immigration, a lot about class, the fluidity of class and status in general. If there's a war, maybe you're the top. If there's when you're not on the good side, maybe you're on the bottom. And there's all kinds of things that happen to people. Aside from all that, so that's what really made me into the person that I am standing before you today. But as far as collective work matters, in terms of what it has actually done for my life, a lot of times my struggle as an African who was born abroad but then raised in the States and very connected to being from abroad, but also very much created by my experience in America, was that I didn't feel I had a collective. That was usually my problem. I felt like I didn't really have people who fully understood my humanity. And that's a really important thing, to have people who kind of get where you're coming from, so you're not constantly presenting yourself, you know, and finding the right catchphrases to, like, you know, Kenya, like runners, right? Huh? Yes? So I actually really started creating my own space. A lot of my writing, and I also am a producer, was about creating the space for myself to be comfortable And I also knew there were a lot of other people like me, but they weren't always in a position to actually maybe create that space for themselves because they're too busy working and trying to live life and pay bills and do things like that. So as an artist, as someone who really committed her life to being an artist, I realized as much as that gave its own kind of level of struggles, it also gave me a lot of latitude and space. And it actually made a lot of other people feel that they had an advocate for them when they were at work and having a terrible day. And I'd write an article about how terrible bosses are or something, and how much institutional racism creates this problem or creates that problem. They feel something, I think, speaking to them and for them. So I actually created my own production company called Africa Underground, and we produce live events here in the city. And I actually produce stand-up comedy, no less. And that's mostly because people don't fully recognize how revolutionary comedy can be. Because as someone who I admire says, comedy is very revolutionary because it allows people who are maybe in positions maybe of less power to laugh at the people in positions of power. And that's probably the most insulting thing you can do to somebody. So I enjoy producing stand-up for that reason, and actually the show that I produce, that's a monthly show here in the city, is the only, well, there's several shows I produce, but one that's gotten the most kind of like a shine so far is the only all-black women stand-up comedy show in the city. And at one of the top 3 clubs. And I do it every month, and I've been doing that for over a year. And in doing that, it's created a space. It's created like an energy and a vibration, and it allows other people to come in. I get a lot of people working at NGOs who are like, I just have to laugh, or people who maybe work in corporate environments and they're like, I got to get this released, I got to get this out of me. And there's something particularly special, I think, about being a person of African descent and all the levels of experience and pathos and trials that you deal with can make you quite witty, I think. And make you have a good sense of humor and, kind of know how to take things and transform them into something that enlivens and creates energy. So my shows always have a lot of vibration and energy, mostly because of really the people that I bring together, and I owe a lot to those comedians who I work with. But then also as a writer, trying to find a community has been also a bit challenging, and I've kind of hopped around into different circles like my brother here, but not quite as established as that because I was burned by institutional education. So I don't think I have a very good feeling about being in institutions per se. No offense, CUNY. I think you guys are awesome. I think you're great. And that's something to be said for that, because I think that we forget that as artists, there was a time where it was just understood you were going to starve. You know what I mean? And it's not that I'm starving, because I'm actually a pretty good business person, but it's more about the fact that sometimes to actually take a leap and get into what you want, you won't necessarily always have the support right then. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't take that leap. It's really important that you do. You should definitely jump. So actually at this point, maybe I'll read you a little piece from an article I have coming out next week with NBC, and it's called 21st Century Racism. So I'll just read you the beginning of it. So, I am a huge admirer of Robert F. Kennedy. In learning American history as a youth, I was struck by RFK's profound humanist transformation from a righteously conservative politician, dare I say a racist, to a truly revolutionary equal rights activist. Undoubtedly, the death of his brother and the racial complexity of the time motivated this change and likely cost him his life. In an unprecedented visit to the apartheid South Africa in 1966, he said the following to a rapt audience at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. This is Robert Kennedy. I'm here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent. A land in which the native inhabitants were first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself as a hostile frontier. A land which tamed rich natural resources through energetic application of modern technology. A land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America. So, that's RFK, not me. So his introductory words were met with uproarious applause from their witty misdirection and candor. As I consider the pervasive racism and police violence against people of color, especially black people in America, and the very fresh police misconduct against black adolescents in McKinney, Texas, I know that the struggle for racial equity is very, very far from over. So that's just the beginning. So I go on to say many more things, and I kind of outline my perspective on how racism manifests itself in our society now, which I usually think is just much more insidious. It's usually more, on the day-to-day, it's the subtle things, and occasionally we see these very large flare-ups when somebody's actually killed, you know, unjustly. But there is this kind of general pall over everything on the day-to-day, and that's something that people are always working with and struggling with. And as a black person in this country, it's something I'm always contending with, and frankly, I can't tolerate. So my writing often gives me that opportunity to discuss it, and then also other people read it, and in that way, I think I end up having that relationship, which I don't necessarily have in the full-on collective sense. So in terms of what kind of spaces my comedy opens up, I think on the one hand, it opens up dialogue with a lot of people. Sometimes, honestly, the comments that I get that are my favorite are the really, really racist ones. And the reason why I say that is because they really help me understand, because usually they're illogical for one reason or another, but the person who's saying it is convinced that they're communicating something very, very important, that they must tell me about my inferiority. And I always find it interesting to understand other people's perspective. I mean, as Nelson Mandela said, you should always know your enemy and know his favorite sport. So, you know, I think it's really good to know what other people think of you, even those people who don't necessarily like you or respect you. And it can also help you transform a lot of the environment around you. Also, in the comedy world, I think, in a way, by producing this show, and now I'm producing more shows in the city as well, I think it, on the one hand, my goal with Sisters of Comedy, which is the show I produce, was to, when I came up with it and I said, oh, it's going to be all black women every month, you know, and I'm just going to keep doing it. And people are like, what, are you going to use the same women every month? And I was like, no. And they're like, are there enough black women comedians out there for you to actually have a show every month? And I was like, yeah, there are. And then they're like, all right, we'll see what happens. And, you know, now a year's gone on, over a year, and I've been doing the show every month. We've been successful. We're regularly written up in Time Out New York. And what's fantastic is our next show actually is going to have Gloria Steinem on the show. Which is really great, a really wonderful feminist and a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So if she believes that there's something valuable about people getting on stage and laughing and making other people laugh and them being women and them being women of color, then I think that is a sign of how you can do something and it can create all kinds of opportunities and space for other people. And I guess the last thing I would say is how my art actually manifests itself. How do you live as an artist? Which I think in some way was a question that was being asked, like how do you actually, what kind of space does your art create, and how do you actually every day manifest it? I think a lot of that has to do with at some point you figure out what it is that you want to say. You know, there's usually a through, like a kind of thread that connects to all the things that you create, and it can be a very abstract idea or it can be a very concrete idea. Like, I know for me, race is a very big thing. Not necessarily for all Africans, because in Africa we don't think of race in the same way we do in the United States. But as someone who's an African who was raised in the United States, and the fact that I consider myself in solidarity with other people of the African diaspora, race to me seems like a very important thing to beat the crap out of. So, so I enjoy kind of beating the crap out of that one all the time. And then, you know, furthermore, I think it's all about relationships and the friendships that you create and the people that you have in your life, and also respecting other artists. I'm big on that. I always pay the artists with whom I work, because I'm like, well, you know, it's you've created something and you deserve actually to be rewarded for whatever it is you created, or at least just have the sign that someone shows the respect for the fact that you actually have authorship, you know. And I hope that people give that same respect to me, you know. So, you know, I have to say that it's been absolutely wonderful speaking to you all right now, and I look forward to the discussion that we might have. So we'll just take it from there.